The morning Sable turned 24, the birds stopped singing. She noticed it belatedly, after the absence had already settled into the air long enough to become its own kind of sound. She had been pulling weeds from the herb garden along the eastern wall of the convent, her hands dark with soil, her mind on the list of tasks Sister Betta had left tacked to the kitchen door. The birds had been singing when she knelt. When she straightened her back and pressed her fists against the ache there, they were not. The convent of the Northern Ridge sat at the edge of the world, or close enough that the distinction hardly mattered. Beyond its stone walls, the forest ran for 3 miles before it met the first road south, and beyond that road lay another 3 days of hard travel before anything resembling a town. Sable had made that journey once, years ago, accompanying Betta on an errand for medicinal supplies the northern traders no longer carried. She remembered the noise of it, the carts, voices layered over each other, the bells from a market stall, and the way it had made her want to turn back before they had even arrived. The convent was quiet. She had always been grateful for that. The birds did not resume. She was still standing in the garden, soil drying on her knuckles, when she heard the horses. Not a single traveler. Not 2. The sound was too heavy, too rhythmic, too deliberate in the way it cut through the morning. She counted without meaning to. 4 horses, possibly 5, and something cold moved through her chest before she had any reason to assign it cause. She was over the low garden wall and pressed against the outer stone before the thought had finished forming. The rough surface bit into her shoulder through her linen shift. She did not move. The riders came into view on the lower path, where it curved around the base of the hill before climbing to the convent gate. 4 soldiers in dark traveling cloaks, the king's sigil visible on their left shoulders even from a distance. She recognized it. The royal decree had arrived at the convent 3 months ago, carried by a single exhausted messenger who had refused the food Betta offered and left without resting. Sable had read it twice, then a 3rd time, convinced she had misunderstood. Music was banned. All of it. Any instrument, any voice raised in deliberate song, any gathering that included melody of any kind. The penalty was arrest and transfer to the capital for judgment. She had asked Betta what the Alpha King could possibly want with silence. Betta had folded the letter carefully along its original crease and said only that powerful men sometimes broke in ways they could not explain, and that the rest of the world was made to adjust. Then she had gone back to her work and not spoken of it again. Sable had tried to comply. She had always sung while she worked, not from joy exactly, but from habit, the way her hands moved through tasks her mind had already filed away. Melody came out of her before she was aware of it, rising and falling with the rhythm of whatever her body was doing. She had bitten the inside of her cheek more times than she could count in the weeks since the decree arrived. It had not always worked. It had not worked this morning. She had been singing in the storage room at the back of the kitchen, softly, without thinking, while inventorying dried herbs, when Betta appeared in the doorway, not wearing the usual expression of mild reproach that meant Sable had let the fire go low or left a tool unsharpened. Something else entirely. Something that made Sable's voice die mid-note. Betta had crossed the room in 3 steps, gripped Sable by both arms, and steered her toward the window that faced the western approach. Below the hill, the soldiers had already turned onto the convent path. "Go," Betta said. "The back gate, through the forest. Do not come back until they are gone." Sable had pulled against her grip. Betta did not release her. "You were singing," Betta said, not quietly. The back gate was unlatched, as it always was. The convent had no enemies and nothing worth stealing. And Sable went through it without her cloak, without her boots, before she had time to decide whether she was being sensible or a coward. She circled the outer wall to the garden, told herself she would only wait until she could see the road was clear, and then the horses appeared, and her body made the decision before her mind could weigh in. From her position against the stone, she could hear the gate, though not see it. Voices, the flat, formal tone of soldiers accustomed to compliance, and Betta's voice beneath it, even and unhurried, giving nothing away. Then a pause. Then the gate closing. Then nothing. Sable waited until the birdsong returned. Slowly, one voice and then another, the way sound always came back after something large had moved through, before she allowed herself to move. She came around to the front of the convent on quiet feet, toes cold against the damp grass, and pushed the gate open. The kitchen was empty. The storage room was empty. The sleeping cells along the upper corridor were empty. Betta was gone. She sat down on the kitchen floor because her legs had stopped being reliable and there was nowhere else to go. The fire was still burning. A pot hung warm on the hook above it, and Betta's herb knife lay clean on the work table, set down with the intention of being picked up again. Sable looked at the knife for a long time. She did not cry. The feeling was too cold and too sudden for that, like stepping through ice into water, the kind of cold that moves past pain into something that simply registers. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breathed until the pressure in her chest found a shape she could hold. Betta had been arrested because of her. Because Sable had been singing in a room with a window, and Betta had heard it from outside, and there had not been enough time to close the distance between them. That was the whole of it. No mystery to it. And the law said infractors were transferred south for judgment in the capital, which meant Betta was already on the road, moving away from the only life Sable had ever known her to inhabit. She did not know how long she sat there before she moved again. Long enough for the pot to begin to steam. Long enough for the specific weight of guilt pressing on her shoulders to become something harder and more purposeful than grief. There was a box in Betta's sleeping cell, on the high shelf above the bed, carved wood, dark with age, that Betta had always relocated without explanation whenever Sable expressed curiosity about it. She had been told it held nothing of interest, in the same tone Betta used to discourage questions she considered settled. Sable had respected it the way she respected most of Betta's closed doors, not from lack of curiosity, but from the understanding that some things revealed themselves when they were ready and not before. She stood on the bed frame to reach it. Inside, folded in careful layers, was a cloth, old, the fabric softened with age past the point of roughness. It had been white once. What remained was a deep cream, almost yellow at the edges, and across its center something had been embroidered in thread so fine it nearly disappeared into the weave. A symbol Sable did not recognize. 2 lines crossing through a central point, with a third curve sweeping beneath them like a pulled bow. Precise, deliberate, made by someone who had known exactly what they were making. Beneath the cloth was a piece of paper, folded twice. She unfolded it. A name written in handwriting she did not know, rounded, slightly unsteady, as though the hand that held the pen had been tired or in pain. A woman's name, followed by a date 24 years past, and beneath it a single sentence. Died in my care, 3 days after the child. The child. Sable read it a second time, then a third. The words were the same each time. She looked at the date again and calculated the distance between it and the morning she had woken to the birds going silent, and the number she arrived at was her own age. She sat for a long time with the cloth in her lap and the paper in her hands. She did not know what the symbol meant. She did not know the woman whose name was written there, or what that woman had to do with Betta, or why any of it had been stored in a box on a high shelf for as long as Sable had been alive. There were too many questions, and she had no way to answer any of them here in this kitchen, with the fire burning low and the soldiers already on the road south. But Betta was being taken to the capital to face judgment for a law she had broken on Sable's behalf. And somewhere in that box was something Betta had considered worth hiding for 24 years. Both things were Sable's to deal with. She did not see any other interpretation. She wrapped the box in canvas from the supply shelf, tied it with cord, and began looking for her boots. She packed what she could carry without slowing herself. The box, a change of clothing, the money Betta kept in the kitchen crock for supply runs. She banked the fire carefully, leaving it low enough to die safely on its own before nightfall. Then she closed the gate behind her and set off through the trees. The road south began 3 miles through the forest, where the tree line thinned at the base of the first hill. She had walked it once before. She remembered the way. She moved faster than she expected, given that she had not eaten and her hands were cold. Twice, she changed direction without fully understanding why, cutting wide around sections of the path and rejoining it further along. Each time, she found afterward that she had skirted places where the ground was churned with recent hoofprints, or where a branch had been snapped at shoulder height by something passing in a hurry. She noticed it the second time it happened and stood still for a moment, listening to the trees around her. There was nothing. Only the ordinary sounds of the forest going about its business, indifferent to her. She told herself it was intuition sharpened by fear. It was not an unreasonable explanation. She did not yet have a better one. The road south was longer than she remembered. 3 days on foot brought her to the edge of the first real settlement she had encountered since leaving. A way station built around a well, with a covered area where travelers gathered to rest horses and exchange news. She arrived at midday, her boots worn damp from 2 river crossings, and found a merchant caravan preparing to continue south. 12 wagons, a mix of traders and hired hands, moving toward the capital with a load of salted fish and northern timber. She paid for passage with the last of the larger coins from Betta's crock and climbed into the 3rd wagon without ceremony. The caravan moved slowly, which suited her. It gave her time to watch, and watching had become something she found herself doing with an attention she could not entirely account for. She noticed things she should not have been able to notice from a distance. The particular tension in a hired guard's shoulders, 2 wagons ahead, the moment a horse 3 rows back shifted from road weariness into something more alert. Small things. Things that resolved themselves before she could decide whether they were significant. On the 2nd day of travel, a man named Osric settled on the bench across from her during a rest stop and did not leave when the caravan moved again. He was older, perhaps 50, with hands built for hard work and eyes that held a steadiness Sable associated with people who had survived things they did not discuss. He had barely spoken for the first day of travel. Now he watched her with an expression she could not immediately classify. "You're not eating," he said finally. She looked down at the bread she had been holding for the past hour. "I'm not hungry. You've been awake for 2 nights running. You've been watching me." "I've been noticing you," he said, with a distinction in his tone that suggested the difference mattered. "There's not the same thing." She said nothing. He let the silence settle for a moment, then leaned forward with his forearms braced on his knees. "How long have your senses been doing what they're doing?" Sable looked at him directly for the first time. "I don't know what you mean." "You changed direction twice yesterday," he said. "Once before the crossroads, once near the birch stand. Both times you moved away from something before it was visible. You felt it through the ground or through the air, and your body responded before your mind had finished the question." He paused. "I know what that is. I'd wager you don't." She held his gaze and did not answer, because the honest response would have required admitting that he was right, and she had spent the last 3 days telling herself it was fear. "I'm an Omega," he said. "Have been my whole life. I know what it looks like when someone's wolf is trying to wake up and no one ever told them they had one." He said it plainly, without drama, the way he might have said he recognized a specific type of wood grain. "Your scent is wrong. Not wrong in a bad way. Wrong like something that's been locked in a room too long. Still there, still entirely itself, but carrying the particular weight of a closed space. Whatever's in you has been in you for a long time without being able to breathe." Sable's hands tightened in her lap. "That's not possible. Most things people say aren't possible are possible," Osric said. "They just haven't happened to those people yet." She sat with that for a moment. The wagon creaked beneath them. Ahead, one of the lead horses snorted and tossed its head, settling again when the driver spoke to it. "If I were what you're describing," she said carefully, "I would have shifted by now. That's how it works. Usually." He tilted his head. "Not always. There are Omegas born to circumstances that suppress it. A mother who died before she could guide it. A childhood without pack, without anyone to reflect the nature back at you. The wolf waits. Sometimes it waits a very long time." He studied her face. "You need a shifter healer, someone who works with shifters, before you get to wherever you're going." "The capital," she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not alarm, exactly. Something quieter. "Then find someone before you go inside the walls. The capital's not a stable place right now, for anyone carrying what you're carrying." He stood and dusted off his hands. "I'm leaving the caravan at the next fork. We won't see each other again." He paused at the wagon's edge. "Be careful about music." She started. "What?" But he had already stepped off, and when she leaned to look back, the fork in the road was visible ahead, and the caravan was already dividing. He walked north without turning around. She held his words for the remaining 2 days of travel and could not decide what to do with them. The capital announced itself before it became visible. A thickening of sound, of movement, of air made dense by too many bodies occupying too small a space. She had forgotten that from her one previous visit, or perhaps she had been too young to register it fully. She registered it now. She arrived in late afternoon through the southern gate, her canvas-wrapped bundle held against her chest, and submitted to the checkpoint inspection with her heart running faster than she would have liked. The guard barely looked at her. He waved her through with the disinterest of a man who had processed 100 travelers before noon. She did not see the second guard note her bundle and send a runner ahead. The petition office for the Alpha King's court sat 3 streets from the palace gate, a low-built stone structure with a clerk's window that faced the street. Sable waited in a line that moved slowly and reached the window as the afternoon light began to flatten. She stated her business: prisoner transfer, northern arrest, convent of the Ridge, grounds for review, and the clerk wrote it down with the mechanical efficiency of a man who wrote everything down and reviewed nothing personally. He told her she would receive a response within 10 days. She asked where prisoners under transfer were held while awaiting judgment. He told her that information was not public. She stepped away from the window and stood on the street with the particular stillness of someone recalculating from the beginning. 10 days was not acceptable. She did not have money for 10 days in the capital, and Beta was somewhere in this city, held in a place Sable could not identify through official channels. She needed another approach. She spent the next morning moving through the market quarters, asking oblique questions about prison locations and transfer protocols, buying small things she did not need to justify her presence at stalls long enough to ask them. She learned that the main holding facility was east of the palace, near the river, but that political prisoners, which a decree violation might qualify as, were sometimes held in the palace annex itself. She was standing near a wool stall on the west side of the market, turning this information over, when she became aware that she was humming. She stopped the moment she noticed it. But the sound had already carried. The wool merchant had looked up, and 2 stalls down. A man in a guard's half-coat had turned his head with the focused attention of someone who had been listening for exactly that sound. She was not carrying an instrument. It did not matter. She was taken to the palace. The holding room off the main corridor was stone, with a high window and 2 guards at the door who did not explain where she was being held or what would follow. Her bundle was taken from her. She sat on the bench that ran along the wall and pressed her palms flat to the cold surface and waited. When they finally moved her, it was into the throne room. She had not expected the size of it. The ceiling vaulted to a height that seemed structural excess rather than practical decision. A room built to make everyone who stood in it feel precisely as small as the stone intended them to feel. Torches along the walls threw light that did not reach the upper arches. The floor was dark polished stone, and her footsteps made a sound she could not suppress, no matter how carefully she placed her feet. There were perhaps 40 people in the room, advisors, guards, 2 men in the formal dark coats of court officials standing close to the dais. Sable noticed the man in silver gray at the edge of the dais first because he noticed her first. He had the habit of attention of someone who catalogued rather than observed. Each detail logged and filed away while the face remained entirely neutral. He was perhaps 55, built with the lean economy of a man who had long since stopped carrying unnecessary weight. His eyes were a cold, flat blue. She looked away before he could register that she had noticed him noticing her. The Alpha King sat at the far end of the room on a chair that was functional rather than decorative. Dark wood, no ornament, elevated on a single step. He was not what she had expected, and she could not have said precisely what she had expected. He was large in the way of men who had spent years working the body alongside political ambition, broad through the shoulders with a jaw set in an expression of settled patience that looked like it had been there long enough to calcify. Dark hair, close cut, a beard grown to the jaw, thick and trimmed. His eyes, when they moved to her as she was brought forward, were an amber so deep they were nearly bronze, and fixed on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with the formal proceedings around him. She felt it before she could name it. A pull, low and physical, starting somewhere beneath her sternum and radiating outward. Not pain, not warmth exactly, Something more precise than warmth, a pressure that recognized something and responded before she had the information necessary to understand the response. She looked away and focused on keeping her breathing even. The charge was read. She had been heard singing in a public market in violation of the royal decree. The penalty at minimum was a fine she could not pay. At maximum, the law left considerable discretion to the crown. She waited for the Alpha King to speak. The silence stretched. She became aware, in the specific way that silence makes certain things audible, that her throat was making a sound. A very small sound. Below what should have been audible in a room this size. She had not made a decision to sing. Her body had simply chosen it, the way it always did when she was frightened and still, and had no other outlet. A barely voiced melody, no words, rising and falling beneath the threshold of her own attention. She heard it the same moment the room heard it. She stopped immediately. But Ren had already risen from his chair. The movement was not deliberate. She could see that. She could see it the way she had seen the horses shift from tiredness to alertness on the road. The way she understood things through the body rather than the mind. He rose because something in him had answered something in her before his reason had weighed in. His hand gripped the arm of the chair. Every muscle in his frame went absolutely rigid. The amber of his eyes had changed. Still amber, but lit from beneath with something animal and immediate, the wolf pressing against the surface from the inside. His jaw was tight. A vein stood out at his throat. He held himself still with the effort of a man standing against a current, and the current was winning by degrees. Then it stopped. Whatever had crested, he held it back by force she could only characterize as extraordinary. The light in his eyes receded. His hand released the chair arm. The room was completely silent. He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them, something had happened that neither of them had the shared language to describe, and the room around them was full of people who had witnessed it without understanding it, which was perhaps worse. "Take her to the East Tower," Ren said. His voice was level and gave nothing away. The guest rooms, under guard but not confined. The man in silver gray at the edge of the dais took a step forward. "My king, the law requires—" "I know what the law requires." Ren's gaze moved to him briefly, then back to Sable. "She stays in the tower." She was escorted out before she could speak. Her bundle was carried separately. She did not see the silver-haired man gesture quietly to a guard near the door, nor the guard carry the bundle to a side room before it reached the tower stairs. By the time she arrived at the room, stone walls, a narrow window overlooking the inner courtyard, a bed with actual linen on it, her canvas wrap was gone. In its place, the guard deposited a folded blanket and a tray of food, and told her someone would bring water in the morning. She sat on the bed and looked at the blank surface of the table where her bundle was not. The guards changed at dawn, and again at midday, and again at dusk. And Sable learned their rotation by the third day without making a deliberate effort to do so. She learned it the way she had learned to navigate the convent by sound, passively, through accumulation, through the body cataloging what the mind had not yet decided was worth attention. The morning guard was methodical and easily bored. The midday guard ate during the last quarter of his shift. The dusk guard was the most attentive, which meant the hour before his arrival was the most useful. She had not been idle. The East Tower connected to the main castle through a covered corridor that opened onto a gallery above the Great Hall. The gallery had a door at its far end that led to the administrative wing. She had seen it when they first brought her through, and she had noted the lock on it, and she had noted that the lock was the kind that yielded to a specific key rather than a guard's physical presence. She had no key, but the gallery itself was not locked, and the administrative wing had a secondary entrance through the inner courtyard that she could reach from the garden passage below the tower if the morning guard left his post for water at the time she had observed him leaving it. He did. She moved through the garden passage on the fourth morning and was inside the administrative wing before the castle had fully woken around her. The archive room was 3 doors from the main staircase, behind a door that was bolted but not locked, a distinction she had learned the hard way at the convent, where Beta made the same distinction with the storage rooms. Bolted meant it was meant to close, not to exclude. She lifted the bolt and went in. The room smelled of old parchment and the particular dry coldness of a space that was used regularly, but heated rarely. Shelves lined 3 walls, organized by reign and by function. Administrative decrees on the left, court appointments and dismissals in the center, medical and curative records on the right wall in a section noticeably thinner than the others. She went to the right wall first. The records were arranged by year. She moved backward from the present, scanning labels written in the cramped shorthand of court scribes until she found what she was looking for. It was not hidden. It was simply filed without emphasis, the way things are filed when the person doing the filing expected them to remain unread. A formal notation dated 24 years prior. Curative assessment of an ailment affecting the Alpha King, submitted by the court healer. Attached notation of dismissal, dated 6 days later. The healer's name was written in the same cramped shorthand as everything else in the room. Sister Betta of the Northern Ridge. Sable stood with the file in her hands and read the notation twice. Betta's assessment was precise and thorough in the way of someone trained to document without editorializing. She described the ailment in physical terms, cataloged the triggers, cross-referenced historical cases of similar afflictions, and in the final paragraph noted that the origin of the condition was not natural illness but deliberate external action, and that the evidence pointed to a specific source. The source was not named in the document. The name had been excised, cleanly, with a blade, a rectangle of absence in the parchment where 2 or 3 words had been. 6 days after submitting this, Betta had been dismissed. And then, with apparently no resources and no explanation, she had appeared at a convent in the far north with an infant and had spent the next 24 years raising that infant in the quietest place she could find. Sable set the file down carefully and pressed both hands flat on the table beside it. She had grown up believing Betta was a woman who had always been exactly what she appeared, a healer in a religious house, skilled with herbs and tinctures and the management of small illnesses. Private, yes. Given to long silences and the particular kind of patience that came from having seen a great deal, and concluded that most things resolve themselves if you waited. But not this. Not a woman who had walked out of a king's court carrying evidence of something serious and chosen a convent as the furthest point available. The question was not whether Betta had known. Betta had always known. The question was what she had been protecting Sable from, specifically, and for how long. She was still standing at the table when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Unhurried, not the particular rhythm of a guard, but deliberate enough that they were not accidental. She replaced the file on the shelf, moved to the door, and waited. The footsteps passed. She gave them time to recede, then slipped back out through the bolt door and returned the way she had come. Gavin found the bundle in the side room off the main corridor on the 5th day, while conducting a routine review of confiscated items pending return or disposal. He was methodical by nature and loyal by choice, and the combination meant he tended to look carefully at things other people processed quickly. The canvas wrap had already been opened and refolded by someone else. He could tell from the crease pattern. And the cloth inside had been examined and apparently dismissed because it had been replaced without the care it deserved. He lifted it and held it to the light from the narrow window. He had been raised in a pack that valued the old knowledge where the elders still kept records of symbols and their meanings. He had not thought about those records in years. He thought about them now. The embroidery was fine enough to have been done by someone who had trained at it, but the placement was not decorative. It was deliberate, centered, a specific configuration of lines that did not appear in standard heraldry or religious iconography. He had seen it once before, in a scroll his mother had kept in a chest beside her bed, among things she considered too important to discard and too significant to display. She had explained it to him when he was old enough to understand the explanation. A true mate bond, confirmed through instinct by a shifter who carried it. Not a hope or a reading, a recognition, embroidered by someone who knew what she had brought into the world. He took the cloth directly to Wren. Wren was alone in the map room when Gavin arrived, which was where he had spent most of the last 5 days when he was not in formal session. Gavin had known him for 12 years and had seen him in states ranging from grief to fury to the particular cold precision that accompanied decisions with permanent consequences. He had not seen this before. This was something that had no name in the vocabulary they had built between them. Ren stood at the window with his back to the room and did not turn when Gavin entered, which meant he had already heard the footsteps and decided to wait. Gavin put the cloth on the table and said what it was. Ren turned. He looked at the cloth without touching it for a long moment, then picked it up with a care that answered several questions Gavin had been carrying since the throne room 5 days ago. "She doesn't know," Gavin said. It was not a question. "She doesn't know anything yet." Ren set the cloth down. "She knows she came from somewhere and that Beta hid the details. She doesn't know what she is." He paused. She was singing because she couldn't stop herself. Not performance, not defiance. It comes out of her the way breathing comes out. The wolf. Suppressed for so long she has no frame for it. Ren's jaw tightened. Whatever her mother was, whoever raised her, the nature was never reflected back to her. It's been building without direction for 24 years. Gavin looked at the cloth on the table. She'll need to be told. I know. Sooner rather than later. If she shifts without preparation. I know, Ren said, with slightly more weight on the second word than the first. Gavin let it rest. He had made the observation. What Ren did with it was Ren's to manage. He left the cloth on the table and went back to his own work, and did not ask whether Ren was going to find a way to return it to her, or keep it as evidence of something he was not yet ready to name aloud. On the 6th morning, Sable's bundle was returned to her room without explanation. The cloth was inside it, refolded. She shook the canvas out carefully, checked every item, the cloth, the paper with her mother's name, the change of clothing, the small knife she kept for practical use. Everything was present except the coins, which she had expected. The cloth had been refolded differently than she had left it. She held it by its edges and studied the symbol again. On the road, Osric had told her to find a shifter healer. He had also told her to be careful about music. He had known something about what she carried, or at least recognized enough to counsel caution. The man had been an Omega. He had lived in a world where these things had names. She did not have a name for the symbol, but someone in this castle had looked at it carefully enough to refold the cloth with more care than it had received when it was first taken from her, and that person had chosen to return it rather than keep it. She turned that fact over for a while. Then she went to find Beta's location on her own. The market district east of the palace wall had a particular kind of establishment near every major city, not taverns exactly, and not shops, but the intermediate spaces where information moved, because people with different kinds of access to different kinds of places happened to share a table. She found one on the 2nd Street past the East Gate and spent the better part of the morning trading what she knew about northern trade routes for what a wine merchant's contact knew about prisoner holding arrangements near the river. She had almost enough to triangulate the specific facility when the two men found her. She felt them before she saw them. The same mechanism that had rerouted her on the road. The sense of weight and intention moving in her direction with a specificity that had nothing to do with general traffic. She was already rising from the bench when the first one came through the door. She did not wait to identify them. She went out through the back. The alley behind the establishment ran between two buildings and met the river road at a sharp angle, which gave her a brief visual advantage. She used it, moving fast and low, cutting toward the market crowd where numbers would slow pursuit. The first man was faster than she had measured. He closed the distance on the open stretch and grabbed her shoulder with a grip that was not arresting her, was not restraining her in any official sense, and was not going to let go. Something happened in her body that she did not have language for. It began as pressure. The same pressure she had felt in the throne room, but compressed and immediate, and no longer patient. Her shoulder where the man gripped it went hot, not with pain, but with something that moved outward from the contact point through her entire frame in under a second. Her vision sharpened to a degree that was not human. She could smell him. Not just his presence, but the specific components of him, sweat and leather and something acrid beneath. The chemical signature of someone who had been given an order and intended to complete it. Her muscles moved before she decided to move them. She twisted in a direction the grip had not accounted for, dropped her weight, and came up free. She did not understand what her body had just done. She staggered 2 steps because her legs were not accustomed to the weight distribution her instincts had used, and her hands. She looked at her hands. The skin at her forearms had changed for a moment. She was certain of it. A shift of texture, of density, something that was not human and was not fully anything else, suspended between two states for the span of 3 seconds before receding. The second man was raising a hand to signal someone across the street. She ran. She made it 4 streets before she ran directly into Ren. Not metaphorically. The physical collision stopped her progress entirely and would have taken her off her feet if his hand had not caught her arm. The same grip position as the man in the alley. The same immediate pressure of contact, but entirely different in quality. She felt the bond respond to him the way she had felt it in the throne room, the low recognition that moved through her chest before her reason had time to categorize it. She pulled back. He let her, but did not release her entirely, keeping a hand at her elbow as her legs finished their assessment of whether they were going to hold her up. "You sent them," she said. "I did not." His voice was flat, with a particular kind of flatness that came from contained anger pointing in a specific direction that was not her. His eyes moved past her shoulder to the street she had come from, scanning it, then returned to her face. "Can you walk?" "I can walk. Tell me who did." He looked at her for a moment. His jaw was set. He had come from the palace on foot, without guard, which meant he had come quickly and without announcing his direction to anyone who would have assigned him an escort. She filed that away. "Come with me," he said. "Not until you answer the question." The street around them was moving with ordinary market traffic, people parting around them with the particular avoidance of bystanders who have recognized someone of rank and decided not to be near whatever is happening. Ren was aware of this. She could see him calculating time and exposure and arrival of actual guards in roughly the same way she was. "Edric," he said. The name came out with a controlled brevity that suggested it was carrying a great deal of weight that he was choosing not to distribute at this moment. "My High Steward. He reviewed your intake documentation when you arrived." She thought of the silver-haired man at the edge of the dais. The cold, flat blue of his eyes. The way his attention had moved over her with the specificity of someone who recognized what he was looking at. "He took my bundle first," she said, "before it reached the tower." "I know." Something moved in Ren's expression. "I have it now." "The cloth." She went still. "You looked at it." "Gavin looked at it, then brought it to me." He held her gaze. "I know what the symbol is, Sable." She had not told him her name. He had known it from the throne room, from the arrest documentation, and had not used it until now. The sound of it in his mouth landed with a weight she did not want to examine. "Then you know more than I do," she said, "and you've known it since before you sent me to the tower. So tell me what it means, and tell me why you kept it from me, and then we can have an honest conversation about what comes next." He did not deflect. He did not produce a reason that reframed his choice as something other than what it was. He simply looked at her with the amber of his eyes steady and the wolf behind them still and attentive, and said, "You're right. I should have told you immediately. I didn't, and I don't have a defense for that." The honesty of it disarmed her more than an argument would have. She stood in the middle of the street with the sounds of the market moving around them and the ache in her forearms where her body had briefly become something she did not recognize, and waited for him to continue. The apartments had been locked for 24 years, and the lock showed it. The key Ren used was kept on his person rather than on the household ring. She noted that without comment, the way she had been noting things since the market street, filing details that she did not yet know the use of. He had brought no guard. He had told no one where they were going. She had followed him through the inner passage that ran behind the great hall and up a secondary staircase she had not previously located, and if she had been uncertain before about whether he was operating outside the awareness of his own household, she was not uncertain now. The door opened on a smell that was not unpleasant, dried herbs and cold stone and something faintly floral that had survived 24 years of closed air with more persistence than seemed reasonable. Ren stood in the doorway for a moment before he crossed the threshold. She watched his face during that moment and looked away before he registered her watching. She went in ahead of him. The rooms were not large. A sitting room with 2 chairs positioned near a cold hearth, a table beside the window with a ceramic pitcher that still held the ghost of whatever had dried in it years ago, a sleeping room beyond, visible through the inner door. Everything was precisely where it had been left, which was the stillness of a space that had not been cleaned or adjusted since a specific point in time. Not preserved deliberately, but simply not touched, because touching it would have required a decision no one had been willing to make. Her name was Aveline, Wren said from behind her. He had come in and was standing near the hearth, not looking at anything specific. She was not my mate. I want to be clear about that before I explain anything else. I loved her the way you can love someone when you are young and have not yet understood the difference between a choice and a recognition. What I felt for her was real. It was also not the bond. Sable turned to look at him. He met her gaze steadily. She died 24 years ago, he said. Officially of fever, quickly. No prolonged illness, no warning, no opportunity to say anything to anyone that might have constituted a record. He paused. 3 days after she died, I tried to attend the memorial gathering my court arranged. Someone played a single note on a string instrument during the processional. One note. His voice remained level with the effort of someone who had practiced this accounting many times in private. My wolf came out before I reached the door. I destroyed most of the antechamber before I could pull it back. Edric was the one who contained me. Edric was the one who explained afterward that the grief had triggered something, that I would need to be managed carefully going forward, that music in particular carried a risk that responsible governance could not ignore. And you believed him, Sable said. He was the only one with an explanation. Wren's jaw tightened. When something happens that has no framework, you take the framework that's offered. I spent 3 years believing it was grief. By the time I began to doubt that, the decree had been law for 2 years, and Edric had made himself indispensable to the management of my condition in ways that were difficult to dismantle without first understanding what the condition actually was. Sable moved to the window of the sitting room and looked out at the inner courtyard below. A pair of guards crossed it without looking up. The afternoon light was going flat, the way it did in this part of the castle where the buildings blocked the western sun earlier than made practical sense. The night in the throne room, she said, when I was singing. The wolf responded, he said, but not the way it has for 24 years. Not with the loss of control, the compulsion to act on something destructive. It responded with, he stopped, started again. Recognition. The bond does not trigger the malediction. I don't know the full mechanism of it, but the bond is older than whatever Edric used. It has precedence. She turned from the window. But it hasn't broken the curse entirely. No. He looked at her directly. I think, and Gavin thinks, having read more on the matter than I had reason to until recently, that the bond breaking the curse completely requires the bond to be complete. While you can't shift, while your wolf has never manifested, the bond is present, but not fully complete. The curse runs in the gap. She absorbed that. So, your curse breaking depends on me managing something I have never done and don't know how to do. That's an accurate summary. That's a significant thing to tell someone. Yes, he said, without elaboration or apology. She looked at him for a moment longer, then turned and walked through the inner door into the sleeping room. It was smaller than the sitting room, with a single window and a bed that had been stripped to the frame at some point. Recently, relative to the rest of the room, because the dust on the frame was thinner than the dust on the furniture. Someone had removed the bedding and not replaced it. She moved past the bed to the writing table against the far wall, which still held its contents: a small ceramic ink pot, long dried, a pen with a worn nib, a stack of blank parchment that had curled at the edges with age. And beneath the parchment, folded in thirds and not sealed, a letter. She picked it up before she had consciously decided to, the same way she sometimes moved before she understood why. The handwriting inside was different from the cramped shorthand of court scribes. Rounder, faster, the writing of someone working quickly under pressure or strong feeling. She read the first line and then looked up. Wren was in the doorway. "Did you know this was here?" she asked. No. She read the letter fully. It was not long, perhaps 150 words, written on a single side of the parchment. Aveline had known she was dying before it became acute. She had written the letter during a window of lucidity before the end, and the letter named Edric with the specificity of someone who had been watching carefully and arrived at a conclusion she could support. The evidence she cited was behavioral and circumstantial, but coherent. Access to the kitchen during the relevant period, a conversation she had overheard, a specific request Edric had made of one of the household staff that had not made sense to her until she became ill. Sable set the letter on the table and looked at it. "She didn't seal it," she said. "No. Is there a seal anywhere in this room? Anything with her mark on it?" Wren moved to the writing table and opened the small drawer below the surface. Empty. He checked the second drawer. A broken seal press, the design worn past readability. He set it on the table beside the letter and did not say anything, because the problem was apparent without narration. An unsealed letter, written in a hand no one in the current court had on record, naming Edric in terms serious enough to compel action, and no way to authenticate it against a forgery claim. Edric had allies on the Judicial Council who would raise that argument before the letter had been read aloud in full. A single clerk with the right allegiances could tie the authentication process in procedural knots for months. "We need Beta," Sable said. "Yes. She was the healer who documented the curse. She was dismissed by Edric 6 days after submitting her assessment. She has lived in the furthest convent from this city for 24 years because he threatened her into silence." Sable picked up the letter carefully and refolded it. She witnessed what happened to Aveline. "I don't know how much she saw, but she was here. She was the court healer. Her testimony has legal standing that a letter without a seal does not." She paused. "She's in the holding facility near the river. She was transferred from the north when she was arrested. I confirmed it in the market before Edric's men found me." Wren looked at her. "I wasn't idle in the tower," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it, the quality of someone recalibrating an assessment. "I'm beginning to understand that." She set the letter down on the writing table and stood looking at it for a moment, and then the pull she had been aware of since the throne room moved through her chest with a different quality than before. Not the low pressure of recognition, but something fuller, a tide rather than a current, moving outward from her sternum and meeting something that was moving inward from the direction of the man standing 3 feet away from her. She felt his wolf before she saw it in his face. Amber going deep and lit, the animal rising to the surface, not with the violence of the curse, but with the steady, unhurried attention of something that had been waiting a very long time and had finally located what it was waiting for. She did not step back. The bond settled between them in the private quiet of Aveline's rooms with no witnesses and no ceremony, which was perhaps the most honest way it could have happened. It was physical and specific and nothing like warmth. It was the sensation of something that had been incomplete for 24 years, clicking into alignment. Two things that had been oriented toward each other without the ability to fully connect, finally connecting. It moved through her whole body and settled. Her wolf, still unshaped and unnamed, pressed against the surface of her with an urgency that was almost painful. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. The pressure receded to something manageable. When she looked up, Wren's eyes had returned to Amber. His breathing was controlled. He had one hand against the wall at his shoulder, not for support, but for something to press against, something solid and external and resistant. "That's what the bond feels like when it's working," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "I noticed." They stood in the dead woman's sleeping room for another moment, with the letter on the table between them and the particular silence of a place that had held grief for 24 years, now holding something entirely different. Then Sable picked up the letter, tucked it inside her clothing against her ribs, and said they needed to discuss how to get to Beta before Edric moved her. Edric received the report from his man that same evening. The Alpha King and the girl had been seen entering the old apartments together. They had remained inside for over an hour. They had emerged without guards, without announcement, and returned to the main castle through the back passage, which meant Wren had been operating outside the normal household awareness, deliberately, specifically, with the particular intentionality of a man who had stopped trusting his own staff. Edric sat with this information for a long time. He had managed Wren's isolation for 24 years with precision that he considered one of his finer accomplishments. Not cruel, not careless, but thorough. A man who cannot hear music cannot attend public ceremonies without risk. A man who cannot attend ceremonies without risk requires constant management. A man who requires constant management is never entirely the authority he believes himself to be. The arrangement had served everyone who mattered. The girl complicated the arrangement in ways that were now moving past the point of discreet resolution. He needed a different approach, not removal, that had already failed once in the market, and a second attempt would generate questions he could not afford. Something slower, something that worked through the court's existing suspicions rather than against them. He called for his scribe before the evening meal and dictated 3 separate documents over the course of an hour. The first was a formal note to 2 members of the Judicial Council raising concerns about the unprecedented circumstances surrounding the girl's detention. The second was a more personal letter to a lord with considerable influence in the Northern Territories, noting that a woman of unknown origin had arrived in the capital with items suggesting foreknowledge of the Alpha King's private vulnerabilities, the kind of foreknowledge that a careful person might describe as suspicious. The third was a request to the archive room for any records related to bond manipulation, specifically cases where an Omega had engineered proximity to an Alpha for purposes other than genuine recognition. The documents went out before nightfall. By the following morning, the question was circulating in the corridors of the castle. Who was the girl from the north, and what exactly had she known when she arrived? The holding facility near the river was not what Sable had imagined, which meant she had been imagining something worse. It was functional rather than punitive. A stone building of 3 floors with barred windows on the lower 2 and a courtyard that smelled of river mud and old timber. The guards at the entrance wore the palace livery and processed their arrival with the bureaucratic thoroughness of men who had been instructed to be thorough by someone with enough authority to make the instruction stick. Gavin had the authority. He had also, Sable noted, not told Wren they were coming this morning, which was either an oversight or a deliberate decision. She did not ask which. Gavin had been Wren's beta for 7 years and understood the mechanics of his king's blind spots better than anyone who might have been asked the question diplomatically. Beta was on the 2nd floor, in a room that was small but private, with a window that admitted actual light. She was sitting at the room's single table when the guard opened the door, her hands folded in front of her, her posture carrying the settled bearing of someone who had been sitting quietly for a long time and had made peace with the practice. She looked up when Sable came in. Something moved across her face that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. The expression of someone who had spent a long time carrying the weight of a specific knowledge and had arrived at the moment of setting it down. "You found the box," Beta said. "You left it where I could find it," Sable replied. Beta looked at her for a moment, then nodded once, with a gravity that acknowledged the accusation in the observation without disputing it. "Sit down," she said, "both of you. This will take time, and I would rather say at once than be interrupted." Gavin stood near the door. Sable sat across from Beta and waited. Beta began with the beginning, which was not the convent and not Sable's birth, but a position she had held in this city for 11 years before either of those things. She had been court healer under Wren's predecessor and remained in the post when Wren took the throne. She described it without sentiment, a professional role, demanding and specific, requiring the kind of discretion that she had maintained carefully for the entirety of her tenure. She had not been close to Aveline, she clarified, but she had been present. She had been present when the illness moved too quickly, and she had been present at the end, and she had been the one called to document the cause of death. The cause of death was poison, Beta said, administered over a period of weeks in small enough quantities that each individual dose would have appeared consistent with illness progression. I documented what I found. I submitted the assessment. 6 days later, Edric came to my rooms before first light and sat across a table very much like this one and explained to me in precise and specific terms what would happen to the infant girl I had carried from the convent to the capital 3 weeks prior if I chose to make my findings available to anyone with the authority to act on them. Sable's hands were still on the table. "He knew about me," she said. "He had known about you since before you were born," Beta said. "Your mother came to the convent already carrying you, 8 months before she died. She was an Omega without pack, traveling alone, which was dangerous and which she appeared to understand clearly. She would not say where she had come from. She worked in exchange for shelter and was not asked for more than she offered." Beta paused. "In the last weeks before she died, she became altered, not ill. Something else. She began the embroidery without explaining it. She worked on it every night until it was finished, and she could not tell me what the symbol meant, only that her hands knew what to make. 3 days after she completed it, she went into labor. She did not survive the birth. And the cloth, Sable said. She asked me to keep it with the child. Those were the last words she said clearly. Betta's voice did not waver, but she looked at her folded hands for a moment before continuing. I did not understand the symbol's significance then. I learned it years later, from a reference in a text I found while managing the castle's medical archive. An omega, embroidering a bond mark in thread without understanding why is documented in old shifter literature as an instance of the mate recognition, acting through instinct before the bond can be consciously acknowledged. Your mother had never met Ren. But something in her wolf knew what you were going to be, and it left a record. The room was quiet except for the sound of the river through the small window. You kept all of this from me for 24 years, Sable said, because Edric threatened you. Because he threatened you, Betta said. There is a difference. I was not afraid for myself. Sable looked at the woman who had raised her. The white hair, the steady hands, the eyes that held the familiar combination of guilt and certainty that belongs to people who have made decisions they believed were right and carried the weight of them fully. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, I need you to testify. I know, Betta said. I came south knowing I might be asked. Gavin pushed off from the wall near the door. We need to move before Edric learns she's been contacted. The Judicial Council convened the following morning in the Great Hall's formal session configuration, the long table occupied by 7 members, with the Alpha King seated at the head in the chair that was functional rather than ceremonial. Sable stood on the left side of the floor with Betta beside her. Edric stood on the right, with 2 council members whose body language had been aligned with his since the session was called to order. The first day established the evidence. Betta's testimony was precise and detailed, delivered with the credibility of a woman who had spent decades treating illness and documenting what she found. She described the poison, the timeline, the assessment she had submitted, and the conversation with Edric afterward without editorializing. Aveline's letter was presented. Edric's council allies immediately contested its authenticity. No seal, no witness to the writing, no chain of custody that could rule out fabrication by any party with motivation to produce it. Edric himself spoke with the controlled fluency of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for years. He acknowledged the letter's existence, but disputed its authorship. He raised the question of Sable's arrival in the capital with items specifically relevant to the Alpha King's private vulnerabilities, foreknowledge he called it, that warranted serious examination. He used the word manipulation twice in the same address, and each time he used it, 2 of the council members shifted their posture fractionally in a direction that suggested the word was landing. The first day ended without resolution. The second day was worse. Edric's formal submission to the council contested the validity of the mate bond itself, citing 3 historical cases in which an omega had been found to have engineered proximity to an alpha for reasons unrelated to genuine recognition. He requested that the bond be examined by an independent assessor before any proceedings advanced further, on the grounds that judgments made under the influence of an unverified bond were compromised by nature. 2 of the council members supported the request. 3 opposed. The chair called a procedural recess that lasted 4 hours and resolved nothing. Sable spent the recess in the corridor outside the Great Hall with Gavin, going over the available evidence and identifying what was missing. What they had was substantial but not clean. Betta's testimony was unimpeachable in her view, but could be characterized as the account of a woman with motive to support Sable's position. The letter needed authentication that the broken seal press could not provide. The records from the archive documented Betta's dismissal, but not its cause. Every piece pointed in the same direction, and Edric's allies were very skilled at standing between a pointed finger and its target. He's going to run, Gavin said quietly, during the second hour of the recess. If he calculates that the third day is going to move against him, he'll be gone before the morning session. Then we need the third day to be conclusive, Sable said. How? She did not answer because she did not have one. The third day began with Edric attempting to introduce a witness, a merchant from the Northern Territories who claimed to have seen Sable in possession of palace documentation before her arrival in the capital, suggesting she had obtained information through channels that implied prior contact with someone inside the court. The merchant was nervous in a specific way that suggested he had been given his account rather than lived it. Sable listened to the testimony and felt something building in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite the bond pressure and not quite the thing that had happened in her forearms in the alley. It was all of those things at once, layered and pressing. The wolf that had been waiting 24 years, moving against a surface that was wearing thin. She had not slept the previous night. She had been going over Edric's documents, looking for the inconsistency she could feel without being able to locate. The place where his constructed narrative had been built on something fragile. She had found it before dawn, in the false evidence itself. The merchant described specific palace documentation by name, a record that Sable was supposed to have obtained before her arrival. But that record had only been created 3 months ago, after Sable had already entered the capital, and it concerned a later arrest involving another woman entirely. The merchant's account placed Sable discussing it on the northern road before she ever reached the city. His version required her to know the contents of a document that did not yet exist. She presented this to the council when the merchant finished his testimony. She laid it out without dramatics, the way Beta had laid out her testimony, methodically, specifically, following the logic from premise to conclusion and letting the conclusion speak. The merchant was recalled. He could not explain the discrepancy. He looked at Edric twice during the questioning, which the council chair noted aloud. Edric stood and began a counter-argument. His voice was still controlled. His hands were still quiet at his sides. He was a man who had built his career on the ability to maintain composure under pressure, and he was maintaining it now, and it was not going to be enough, and something in Sable knew it before the argument was finished. The pressure in her chest became unbearable. It was not pain, which was perhaps why she did not identify it as warning until it was already happening. It was fullness, the sensation she had felt when the bond settled in Aveline's rooms, but amplified beyond any proportion, beyond anything she could moderate or redirect. Her wolf pressed against every surface at once, not with violence, but with a certainty that had simply run out of patience after 24 years of being unacknowledged, and her body made the decision her conscious mind had never been offered the opportunity to make. The shift took 11 seconds. She had been told afterward by Gavin, who had counted. She had no memory of it as a sequence of events, only the pressure becoming release, the particular violence of bones finding new configurations, the cold stone floor against 4 points of contact, rather than 2. The council chamber went absolutely silent in the way that rooms go silent when something has happened that bypasses the brain's normal processing speed entirely. She was a wolf, white-gray, the color of her mother's cloth, standing in the middle of the great hall's judicial floor, with her sides heaving, and the bond radiating through her in waves she could no longer contain or manage, because she was not built for containment right now. At the head of the table, Ren rose from his chair. She heard it before she saw it, the absence of something that had been present in the room for 24 years, a constraint lifting, not dramatically, but completely, like a lock whose mechanism had finally worn through. The curse dissolved the way things dissolve when they have been maintained by external pressure, and the pressure is removed. Not with sound or light, but with the quality of a room when a fire goes out. A change in the air, a change in the temperature, a change in the specific weight of the space. Ren stood at the head of the table without any visible sign of struggle for the first time in 24 years. His wolf was entirely present in his face and entirely at rest. He looked at her across the room, and the amber of his eyes was steady and full and carrying something that had no adequate word in the formal vocabulary of a judicial session. So he did not attempt to use that vocabulary. He simply looked at her, and she looked back from the floor of the great hall, and the bond between them was present and complete and witnessed by every person in the room. And Omega could not falsify a shift. The council chair said this aloud after the silence had extended past the point of procedural comfort. It was not a ruling. It was an observation that functioned as one. 2 council members who had been aligned with Edric's position exchanged a glance and made no further statements. Edric moved toward the side door. Gavin had anticipated this. He had placed 2 of Ren's personal guard at the side door before the morning session began, on the reasoning that a man who had survived by managing information would identify his exit before he needed it. Edric was stopped politely, which was worse for him than being stopped otherwise. Being stopped politely in full view of the council meant there was no version of events in which his departure could be characterized as anything other than flight. He was seated. He remained there for the duration. The ruling took until late afternoon. The council deliberated with the thoroughness that the weight of the case demanded, and arrived at conclusions that followed from the evidence rather than requiring it to be pushed. Edric was found to have administered the poison that killed Aveline, to have constructed the malefic curse through a contact the investigation would identify in the subsequent weeks, to have used his position to obstruct justice across 24 years, and to have presented fabricated testimony in the current proceedings. The sentence was delivered without ceremony and received without drama, which was perhaps fitting for a man who had run his schemes with precisely that quality. The decree banning music was revoked the following morning, in a session that took less than 10 minutes. Wren signed it without speech. The question of Sable's position, an omega of unknown lineage, no noble blood, no pack affiliation, bonded to the Alpha King in full view of the Judicial Council, was not resolved that week or the week following. 3 territorial lords filed formal objections within the first 4 days. 2 council members requested a review of the bond's political implications. The Northern Territories, hearing that the woman arrested for singing at a convent had ended up bonded to the Alpha King and instrumental in the removal of the High Steward, sent a delegation to the capital that arrived before the month was out. Sable was present for every session. She stood where she needed to stand and said what needed to be said and did not perform patience she did not feel, which meant some sessions went worse than they might have if she had been more diplomatic, and some went better because people who had expected accommodation found something else instead. Beta was given rooms in the castle and resumed a version of her former role that was not officially titled because the official title required a council vote that had not yet been scheduled. She worked around this with the equanimity of a woman who had spent 24 years making do with available materials. The white-gray wolf that had stood in the judicial chamber became a detail that spread through the castle and then through the city and then through the territories with the particular speed of a story that contains enough genuine strangeness to resist embellishment. People added elements, as they always did. The elements they added said more about what they wanted the story to mean than about what had actually happened. What had actually happened was this. A woman who had been singing her whole life without understanding why had arrived at the place her nature had always been pointing toward, and the law that had tried to silence her had not survived the arrival. The rest was still being written, in sessions and objections and delegations and the slow, patient work of dismantling what had been built to last indefinitely. It was not clean, it was not finished, but the room was no longer locked, and the key was no longer in someone else's pocket. That was where they started.